Peppa Pig. Alone. Peppa woke up in her bed. Quiet, too quiet. No kitchen sounds, no George's footsteps. The window was shut, but the daylight seemed dull and pale. She walked downstairs. 2 cups sat on the table in the kitchen. There was no steam. Mummy usually sang in the mornings. But now, silence. "Mummy," Peppa called. "George?" No answer, only a faint crackle from the radio, as if it had just been turned off. She walked through the whole house. All the rooms were in place, the beds neatly made, everything tidy, but no one was there. Peppa stepped outside. The grass was damp, the sky, the color of milk, cloudless. The neighbor's door was wide open, but inside, nothing. She knocked on Susie Sheep's door. No reply. Inside, the same eerie neatness. Toys perfectly arranged, an empty sofa, the clock ticking, tick-tick alone. There was no wind on the street, no birds, no cars. The playground was undisturbed, the sand perfectly smooth as if no one had ever played there. She returned home. Then, a click. The radio turned on by itself, static, and then, a voice, low, flat, emotionless. "You weren't supposed to wake up." Peppa froze. "Who is this? Where is everyone?" Silence. She walked through the house again. Doors led to the wrong places. The bathroom door opened to a staircase, the closet to someone else's bedroom. The mirrors turned dim. They showed rooms she wasn't in. She ran back to the radio. "Tell me where my mummy and George are." The voice returned. "We removed them while you slept. You weren't meant to wake up. You broke the order." Peppa cried. She hid under the table, hugging her knees. The whispering from the radio continued, but the words became less clear, as if someone was learning how to speak. The house grew darker. The wall clock stopped. Outside the window, nothing. No shadows, no footsteps, no trees, only blank whiteness, as if the world was being erased. A sheet of paper appeared on the floor, drawn in crayon, her room, and a single message. "There's no way back." The radio spoke again, now in her own voice. Perfect mimicry. Phrases she had already said. Repeated, like a recording, but slower each time, and more distorted. She didn't know how long it had been, whether it was day or night. But on the 7th time the radio said her name, a new voice came from the speaker, software, childlike. "Peppa, I'm outside, come out, only you, we'll start again." She walked to the front door, opened it, but it wasn't the street. Only whiteness, endless, a figure in the distance, tall, blurred, too thin, too still, and all that remained in the house, an open door, an empty radio, and a single line carved into the wall. Now everything is correct again.
Peppa Pig, The Cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet, scraping. A knock, slow, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George," she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word, "Open." Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall. not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's, Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, no cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. You probably had a bad dream, said Mummy Pig gently. Let's try to forget about it. But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then a voice, a whisper. I'm almost out, don't turn around. Peppa Pig, eyes in the dark. In the Pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. George, what are these drawings? Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. You'll find out soon, he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. George, Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. George! Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. George is no more, came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. No! Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty. And on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft, and familiar. But now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George. And in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall.
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, Voices on the Second Floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen.
This is the story of what happened when Peppa Pig's family went to the beach for what they thought would be a normal day. But sometimes, the most dangerous predators wear the most innocent disguises. It was a sunny day when the Pig family arrived at the beach. Peppa was building sandcastles when she noticed strange footprints in the sand. Clear impressions of sneakers leading directly from the ocean onto the beach. "Daddy, look at these footprints," Peppa called out. Daddy Pig chuckled. Someone probably just walked into the water wearing their shoes. But Peppa followed the sneaker prints towards some large rocks. As she got closer, she heard soft, melodic humming. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. Peppa crept around the rocks and gasped. Sitting on the sand was an enormous shark wearing bright blue Nike sneakers, singing happily to itself. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark sang, noticing Peppa. It grinned with rows of sharp teeth. "Hello there! Want to play?" Despite her fear, Peppa found herself playing beach ball with the creature, watching as it skillfully kicked the ball with its sneaker-clad fins. "You're really good at this," Peppa laughed. "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la! I love to play," the shark sang back. That evening, a loud knock echoed through their house. When Daddy Pig opened the door, there stood the shark, still wearing its blue sneakers. "Hello, I've come to visit. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la," the shark announced, pushing inside and making itself at home. The shark squeezed through the doorway and began devouring everything at the dinner table. Plates, food, even the tablecloth. "What on earth is happening?" Mummy Pig exclaimed. "I was hungry. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." It sang with its mouth full. From that day forward, everything changed. The shark decided to stay and established new rules. Everyone had to wear sneakers and sing tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la throughout the day. The shark took over Peppa's bedroom, forcing her to sleep on a mat. One night, Peppa and George tried to sneak out, but the shark was waiting at the door. "Where do you think you're going? Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, nobody leaves my family." It sang menacingly, dragging them back inside. The house transformed quickly. Windows were sealed with thick glass, water filled the lower floors, and a sign appeared reading, "Danger, aggressive shark inside." Neighbors would walk by and hear singing from inside, "Tra-la-li-lo, tra-la-la." We're all one family now. Through the round window, you could see them, Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, all wearing blue sneakers, all singing the shark's song. Behind them, the massive silhouette swam in circles, its toothy grin never fading. And so the shark had found its perfect family. The beach was quiet again, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. Tra-la-li-lo, tra-la-la. And if you do, you'd better run, because the shark is always looking for new family members to join its endless.
This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig, has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside. But something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig.
The day was damp and overcast. Rain had fallen since morning, and only by evening did it subside, leaving the yard filled with shining puddles and wet grass. Peppa and George ran outside, jumping in the puddles, laughing, building a little tower of stones. Everything seemed ordinary. Inside the house smelled of dinner, and from the kitchen came Mummy Pig's voice. But when the sun finally disappeared, a strange sound drifted from the forest. It wasn't barking, nor the creak of wind. Heavy, dragging breaths, as if something enormous was slowly moving between the trees. Peppa stopped and peered into the thicket. There, in the shadows, stood a tall figure. At first she thought it was a deer, but its steps were too slow, too heavy. Each hoofbeat sent a shudder through the ground. And then Peppa saw the eyes, red, burning like embers in the dark. Massive antlers tangled with branches as if the forest itself had grown through the creature. "Peppa!" George whispered, clutching her hand. The figure took a step forward. The ground trembled. The children screamed and rushed to the house. Daddy Pig flung open the door and pulled them inside, quickly locking the bolts. In the same moment, the silhouette loomed over the windows and the antlers scraped across the roof, leaving long scars. The house grew cold, the air thickened, the lamps flickered. In the glass appeared not their familiar reflections, but shadows with crimson eyes. Mummy Pig clutched George, and Peppa felt the walls were breathing, letting in strange sounds, the whisper of branches, the crack of bark. The monster did not leave. It slowly circled the house. Each step left deep hoof prints, and those prints seemed to echo inside as well. The floor shuddered, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The house responded to every movement. Daddy Pig tried to draw the curtains, but the fabric clung to the glass. Beyond the window, there was no yard, only thicket, dense and endless. The moon broke through the branches, and between them, the red eyes flared again. The creature came closer. Its antlers struck the wall, and cracks spread through the wood. Shadows stretched out, forming shapes like hands. Peppa and George pressed themselves against their mother. "He won't leave," Peppa whispered. The monster loomed on every side. Its breath was heard everywhere, from beneath the floor, from the corridors, from the very roof. The air turned icy, and each breath came heavy, as if the house itself lived and breathed with it. In the living room, the light went out. In the darkness, only the eyes remained. They were outside and inside, seen in the windows, in the mirror, even in the black corners of the room. Daddy Pig grabbed the children's hands, but a step backward changed nothing. Behind them, the walls were no longer walls. Instead of wallpaper rose damp tree trunks, and roots pushed up through the floor. The house was turning into forest. Mummy Pig held George tight. Peppa clung to Daddy's hand. All four huddled in one corner, but corners no longer existed. The house dissolved, and the forest took its place. The whisper filled everything. It almost sounded like words, but none could be understood. Only one feeling remained. There was nowhere to go. The last thing the family saw was the creature's antlers breaking through the ceiling and its red eyes reflecting in every window at once. Since then, no one has seen the pig family. Their house still stands in the same place, but on rainy evenings it seems to merge with the forest. Inside it smells of resin and damp bark. Stains darken the walls, and pine cones lie in the corners. They say sometimes through the glass you can glimpse reflections, not just empty rooms, but red eyes, unblinking and cold. And in the thicket near the house, children's voices are heard, calling for help. The deer monster no longer returns to the forest. Now he is here, and he waits.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa came downstairs for dinner to find her family already seated at the dining room table. But something was terribly wrong. They were all sitting perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. The table was set for dinner, but the plates contained food that Peppa didn't recognize, dark, shapeless masses that seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George all turned to look at her simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized like clockwork dolls. Their smiles were too wide, stretching across their faces in ways that looked painful, and their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. "Sit down, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "It's time for dinner." Peppa approached the table cautiously and saw that her chair was the only one without the strange, moving food. Instead, her plate held what looked like a normal meal, but as she got closer, she realized the food was arranged to spell out words, "Join US." The family continued to stare at her with those horrible smiles, waiting for her to sit down. When she hesitated, they all tilted their heads to the side at exactly the same angle, the movement creating a soft clicking sound like breaking bones. "Sit down, Peppa," they repeated, and this time their voices echoed strangely, as if coming from far away. Peppa noticed that the dining room seemed larger than usual, the walls stretching away into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead light. The family began to eat their strange food with mechanical movements, never breaking eye contact with her, never blinking. As they ate, their smiles grew even wider, and Peppa could see that their teeth had become sharp and pointed. The food on her plate began to rearrange itself, the letters changing to spell out new words. "Stay forever." Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her toy train set in the living room. The train, usually so cheerful, began to make strange, clanking noises, and its lights flickered erratically. She tried to stop it, but it sped up, circling the room faster and faster, leaving a trail of dark, oily smoke. The smoke filled the room, making it hard to see, and the clanking grew louder, more menacing. The train cars transformed, their windows becoming empty, staring eyes, and their wheels grinding like teeth. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa stumbled back, her heart pounding. The train was no longer a toy, but a monstrous entity, chasing her around the room. She could hear faint whispers coming from the train, calling her name, inviting her to join its endless journey. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted train seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the train was gone, but the tracks were etched into the floor, glowing with an eerie green light. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the glowing green tracks, leading into an abyss. And then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim.
Peppa Pig, the twin brother. One evening, Peppa Pig's family was expecting a guest. Daddy Pig's twin brother, Gilbert, was coming to visit for the first time in many years. Daddy Pig often talked about how inseparable they were as children, but Gilbert had moved far away, and they had barely seen each other since. That evening, the doorbell rang. Standing on the doorstep was Gilbert. He looked exactly like Daddy Pig, but something about him was off. His smile was too forced, and his eyes seemed empty. During dinner, he barely spoke, silently observing everyone. His movements were unnatural, as if he was learning how to use utensils for the first time. George hid behind his chair the whole time, and Peppa felt uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange creaking sound. In the hallway, in front of the mirror, stood Gilbert. He wasn't just looking at his reflection. His reflection was moving with a slight delay, as if struggling to mimic his movements. At one point, he suddenly turned towards Peppa. In the morning, Mummy Pig seemed worried. Daddy Pig was gone. Gilbert was still in the house, acting as if he had always been there. His voice was muffled at first, but as the hours passed, it started to sound more and more like Daddy Pig's. Throughout the day, he imitated Daddy Pig's habits. He sat with a newspaper, tried to joke, but his laughter was hollow. As evening fell, a muffled voice was heard outside. It sounded like Daddy Pig. He was calling for help. Peppa rushed to the door, but Gilbert was already there. He looked at her and slowly smiled. At that moment it became clear. Daddy Pig wasn't coming back. Gilbert had already taken his place. Peppa Pig. George disappeared. George always loved playing in the yard. Every day he ran around the garden with his favorite dinosaur, imagining new adventures. Everything was as usual. Peppa was drawing in her room, Mummy Pig was making lunch, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Through the window, George could be seen running near the big tree. His joyful laughter echoed through the yard. But suddenly, everything fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Peppa looked up. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then she realized George was no longer in sight. The backyard door was slightly open. On the grass lay his toy dinosaur, abandoned in an unnatural position, as if George had simply dropped it. Peppa stepped outside, but the garden was empty. No movement, no sounds, only a gentle breeze. Mummy Pig called for George, but there was no response. Daddy Pig joined the search. They checked behind the bushes, walked around the house, and inspected the fence. But there was no sign of where George could have gone. Half an hour passed. Peppa picked up the dinosaur and noticed strange marks on its plastic back. Narrow, elongated prints that definitely didn't belong to George. The unease grew. They searched the entire yard, the neighboring areas, but it was all in vain. Then Peppa heard a faint sound, a quiet giggle, barely noticeable, coming from behind the bushes. She froze, then slowly walked in that direction. Behind the bushes, no one was there, but the grass was pressed down, as if someone had just been sitting there. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon. The house sank into an eerie silence. The door remained open. On the table, the dinosaur lay still, now cold and forgotten. When darkness fell, Peppa heard the giggle again, this time right by the door.